All right, we are in Hebrews still, amazingly. And Hebrews is written in 7 major sections with an 8th that sort of closes things off. It's written in the form of a chiasmus. The beginning part introduces who Jesus is, that he's God and man, interspersed with a warning to stay on course, and then talking about his role of high priest, that he's a faithful high priest, faithful to God, but he's a compassionate high priest as he ministers to us. Again, interspersed with a warning not to turn back as the Israelites turned back. And then we come to the major section, which deals with his work as high priest. And here he's moved the warnings to the beginning and to the end. The central part being his entering into the temple not made by human hands to offer his blood as sacrifice for our sins, once for all, unlike the Levitical system, which was over and over and over again. Now we're into the 5th major section, which is how do we access this work? He's gone into the heavenly temple. He's sacrificed himself. He's presented his blood to the Father. How do we access that? And the first part is the means. The second part will be the method. But the means is through faith. And it is through faith that we are saved. Last week we spent some time talking about faith and works. And it reminded me that a while back I had mentioned my rock. So I thought I'd bring my rock in again. You remember, the rock story is my daughter once was in school and painted me a rock. And this has become one of my prized possessions, right? And although it probably would qualify as modern art, worth millions of dollars, the value of this to me is that my daughter made it and she gave it to me out of love. A child's simple love. And that's how we present our works to the Father. It may be like my daughter painting a rock, which actually has more benefit now because now I get to embarrass her with it. But when we go to work for God, when we do what we do, if we're doing it to earn a favor, like my daughter had painted that rock and presented to me and says, okay, now give me a candy bar, it would have had a significant different reaction on me than as it was where she just gave it to me because she loved me. And that's the same thing with our works. Our works are not intrinsically of any value. God doesn't need them. But if they're done out as an expression of love for what God has done for us, then they are tremendous value. And their value is in the love that is behind them. So as we're working, if we're doing it because, well, I'm supposed to do it, it's drudgery, and but this drudgery is going to make me get in good with God, then you're doing the drudgery and you're not actually getting any benefit from it. But if you're doing it because of love, which doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to be drudgery, right? It can still, you'll have those days where it's still drudgery. But if it's drudgery that you're doing, and you say, I know this is drudgery, but I'm doing it because I love God, then it's still a great benefit. So, we were working our way through this. We left off in verse 4. We got most of the way through that verse. The one part we didn't address, which is, by faith, Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than did Cain. And by faith he was declared to be righteous, since God himself accepted his offering. And by faith he continues to speak, even though he is dead. And that last part about continuing to speak is when we look back on the lives of these people, right, their testimony is still to us. however long ago it was that Abel gave his sacrifice, it still speaks to us today through his faith of that sacrifice and what he did. Just like all the Old Testament saints, we can still learn. They're still testifying because we have the written word. We have the Bible. And it's through that we still learn and benefit by what they did. Okay, verse 5. By faith Enoch was taken away without experiencing death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he won approval as one who pleased God. So Enoch taken away, that's Genesis 5:24. And Enoch was a very popular figure at this point in time in terms of the first century. There were a lot of books that were ascribed to him. And sometimes we look back and think, these people were really dupes, that they would get a book and think it was actually written by Enoch. I actually don't think that. I actually think they probably understood these to be the same way we now read historical novels. You think about some of the historical novels you read. When we read a historical novel, do we figure that this is actually what happened and this is actually by the person that says it is? No. We know it's a historical novel, but we still read them and we can still get value from them. Right?
Well, knowledge has been lost in the fairly recent past. I mean, the ancient Babylonians talk about how the king used to read the stories prior to the flood.
Yeah.
So there were documents, there were writings, and they've been lost. The library at Alexandria was destroyed.
Yeah.
How much knowledge was lost with the destruction of that library and possibly others?
Yeah, it's, when we look back and we think about what we actually have today, it's a fragment. A lot of the early church history was lost because of the persecution of Diocletian, for example. One of the reasons we don't have a lot of early manuscripts of the New Testament is because Diocletian ordered them all destroyed. Now, he wasn't successful, and he didn't destroy all of them, but one of the reasons we don't have a lot is because of that. We don't have a lot because of just neglect. Cities were destroyed, people moved, and you come across old pictures, for example. What do you do with it? You don't know who these people are. You don't know what to do with them, right? And if they're on glass, they're probably worth a lot of money. But for example, some of the old Civil War paintings that would be worth millions of dollars now if they had them. People didn't know what to do with the glass, so they just put it up in their greenhouses. Used it for glass for their greenhouses, and over the years they just faded away. People can look up there now and kind of vaguely see that there's used to be a picture there, but there's nothing they can get from it now. So lots of stuff has been lost. And when we look at Eusebius, one of the things about Eusebius quotes, he's an early historian from the 3rd century, Christian historian, and he wrote a book called Church History. And in that, he references all sorts of documents and people and writings that we just no longer have. So here, Enoch was a popular figure, and people did read books about him. But there's no indication here that Paul or the author is using any of those books. By the way, Enoch is only mentioned here in Luke 3:37 and in Jude 14. Are there any places that Enoch's mentioned in the New Testament? Now, Enoch was taken away without experiencing death. And if you read the Old Testament, it's a little bit vague as to exactly what happened there, right? Here, any ambiguity has been removed. The text here is very clear. He was taken from earth without experiencing death. Why? Because God had taken him away, for he was taken away. He had won approval as one who pleased God. Think about that statement for how often do we hear in the Bible that this was a person that pleased God. Not very often. Not very often at all. And how did he not get this? How did he please God? By his faith. For it was by faith Enoch was taken away. (11:6) For without faith it is impossible to please God. For whoever comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who diligently search for him. Now, this is a statement combined with a logical argument. Right? For by faith, without faith, it is impossible to please God. And in that, to have faith, don't you have to believe? Yeah, it says, for whoever comes must believe that it exists. Do you go anywhere unless you believe it exists? Yeah, if you got a vacation to the Caribbean and you're going on a cruise ship, you got tickets in your hand and you're getting ready to leave, so you pack and get all prepared. Would you do that unless you actually believed that there actually was a cruise ship at the other end? Do you know there's a cruise ship? Unless you're a frequent, say you're not a frequent cruiser, this is your first cruise. Have you ever been on a cruise? Have you ever seen the ship? No. You haven't been down there yet.
In light of all the recent events, cruise ship might be a bad example.
But still, airplane, you haven't flown before? Heading down to Orlando and Disney World, if you've never been there, but you have faith that it exists. You have faith that you think about what has to happen when you travel across country. Right? All the things, you're connecting flights, right? That when you get to the airport, you're going to be able to get to the hotel, that the hotel won't have lost your reservation. Right? Do you have faith that that whole complicated system is going to work? That when you went online and typed something on your computer, somehow that all works its way through a system that the other end allows you just to get on a plane and fly down there. Right? And you may not have a lot of faith. You may have backups and reserves. For example, when we flew to Idaho a couple weeks ago, right, it was the first time we ever used our phones for our boarding pass. So on the way out, we had paper.
Yeah.
We used our phone, but we had paper in our pocket just in case, because we didn't have a lot of faith.
Mm-hmm.
But we at least had enough faith to give it a try. And on the way back, we didn't have any paper, just our phones. And we had faith that our batteries would last. And chargers in our bag. But that's the concept of faith. That's trusting. When you don't know for 100% sure, that you're still going to act anyway. You're not going to sit there and say, well, I'm not even going to bother to pack or get on the plane because I assume something along the way is going to go bad and it's not going to work out. But we have faith just like we have faith in God. And to have faith in God, don't you have to believe that God exists? Yeah.
There's a God that says, look, there's evidence for me all over.
Mm-hmm.
So, but
Tons of evidence.
it's not. It's still faith, but
It's still faith because can we see it? Can we see God? No. And there's always this little teeny gap. You know, there's lots of evidence. The evidence of if it's when you go into a court of law, if it's a criminal court, you have to be beyond reasonable doubt. I actually think the argument is beyond reasonable doubt, personally, but that's when I read I'm a Christian. But there's also, preponderance of the evidence. Right? Which means even though there is some doubt, you still have the majority of evidence. Well, we are clearly the preponderance of the evidence. Right? But there's still room for doubt. So he rewards those who diligently searched after him. And again, this isn't a crass materialism, I'm going to work and therefore God's got to reward me. Right? Notice that it does not say here, he rewards those who earn it. Because we don't earn it. But it's basically a continuation of the previous argument. Why come unless there's a reason to? If you believe there's a reason but don't come, then you have no faith. The bottom line here is not that we're going to be earning anything, but that God is a God who responds to us. Remember the ancient worlds, they didn't believe that gods really responded that much. Right? You could seek their favor and maybe try to bribe them. But our God is a God who not only exists, but knows us and is concerned for us. Verse 11. By faith Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, reverently prepared an ark to save his family. And by it he condemned the world and inherited righteousness that comes by faith. And the word here for warned is one that implies divine communication. This is not, he read it in the newspaper of the time or something. This is a verb that basically is divine communication. So God told him about things not yet seen. Right? It was something like 100 years from the time that he began building the ark until the ark and the flood came. We get impatient if we have to wait a couple of days for God to answer our prayers. We have to wait, decades sometimes. And we oftentimes think we know better. God, this is the time. This is perfect time, God. Now's when you should do it. Why aren't you doing it, God? If it's the perfect time and you're not doing it, then is it you don't care? Is it you don't exist? And we get ourselves into these types of arguments. When in reality, it may not be the right time. How well can we judge when is the best time for something to happen? Not very well. Have you ever thought that this was the perfect time for something and it didn't happen? Right? You wanted to go someplace or you wanted something to take place and it just, for some reason or another, it didn't happen. And then a short time later you look back and go, wow, isn't that a good thing that we didn't do that?
And sometimes you don't get that either.
Was that?
Sometimes you don't get that either.
No, sometimes you don't, but sometimes you do.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you don't know what happens or what would have happened or what... we don't know the alternate paths. There's a theory in physics, which I happen to disagree with, but it's called the multiverse theory, which is every time you have to make a decision or anyone in the world has to make a decision, the universe splits. And one universe is if you went yes, and the other universe is if you went no. This is one of the ways they try to get away from the idea of free will and choice.
Well, that gives me a lot of power. I can split the universe.
Yeah. Well, if you ever hear people say, "Well, in some alternate universe, I'm a famous actor," or something, that's filtered down from this scientific theory called the multiverse, and it's the idea that there's an infinite number of universes, and therefore all the possibilities that could happen, and we just happen to be in this one. And they do that because when we talked a little bit a week or two ago about the anthropic principle and how impossible it is for life to be here, right? It's less than 1 in 100 chance, probably even greater now, that there would be a single planet in the entire universe, and that's taking into account all the stars in this galaxy and all the stars in all the other galaxies, that even when you take into account that vast, vast number, which is far greater than we can even begin to comprehend, there's still only one chance in 100 that there would even be a planet that would have the right conditions for life.
I've heard even more depressing statistic on that, or less of a chance. If they've done a calculations on how a cell could come about, and a simple cell, they're not simple. The odds of it happening, if you took the entire universe and filled it with electrons, so it was stuffed with little tiny electrons, it still wouldn't be a big enough number for the
No,
chance.
it wouldn't be.
So it's just an absurd number. Mathematicians say it's not possible. It's just absurd.
And that, I said, that's just the conditions for life. That doesn't actually get the conditions to actually get life going. To get life going, I actually do crunch the numbers in one of my book, and it's 10 to the 40,000th, which is a 1 followed by 40,000 zeros.
Oh, and then it has to happen twice at the same time.
Well, I only have, you don't have to have sexual reproduction right at the beginning. But to give you an idea of how big that number is, 10 to the 40,000th, is, let's say there was a lottery, and you bought 100 trillion tickets, because the more tickets you buy, the more chances you have to win. So you're going to try and corner this lottery. You're going to buy 100 trillion tickets a second for 100 trillion years, which is far longer than the universe. The universe, even the scientists say, only 13.5 billion years old. But let's assume you got a head start on the universe. And so you've been buying 100 trillion tickets a minute, or is it a second? One or two. It's not going to make much difference. For 100 trillion years, you would reduce your odds from 1 to 10 in the 40,000th if you only bought one ticket, down to 1 to the 39,965. That gives you an idea of how big that number is. It's beyond our comprehension. Faced with numbers like that, which by any sensible person would say those are impossible, that's what's led scientists to come up with this concept of the multiverse. So that they can have an infinite number of universes. If you have an infinite number of universes, then anything can happen. Right? And then they can say, okay, see, we could have a universe where this seems impossible to have life, but it exists because we're here. And that's literally the argument that they use. Life is possible because we're here.
William Dembski, No Free Lunch.
What's that?
William Dembski has a book called No Free Lunch, which deals exactly with those kinds of odds mathematically.
Yep.
So they always use time as the hero in evolutionary history.
But there's not enough time.
It's not. It's a joke.
There's not enough time.
It's still such a tiny, minute amount of time, even when you're talking about billions. It's nonsensical.
Yep. So, faced with that overwhelming amount of evidence, they jump into this multiverse thing. Now, by the way, if I ever come into, I have come on occasion, I come into people who argue this like, so life could begin because anything is possible. I usually come back with, so the resurrection is possible? Oh, no. That couldn't possibly happen. That's a miracle. We don't allow miracles. We'll have a multiverse. We'll have an infinite number of universes.
I don't have enough faith to believe in that.
I don't either. I also have not heard how they get around the second law of thermodynamics, because if you have two universes and you split them, that seems like you now have twice as much energy, which, actually second law of thermodynamics would be entropy, twice as much entropy, but
they violate all the known laws of physics with all of their theories.
Yeah. It's a little interesting thing is entropy, second law of thermodynamics says that entropy declines. In other words, things get more and more random. Well, highly ordered things are not random. So when the universe, you go to the inflationary Big Bang theory, which is one of the prominent theories for the origin of the universe, one of the two, and when it starts off with a very high entropy. And that has been decaying. So as we see the universe forming into the structures, that's actually a decay in the overall unity which was everything was very uniform to begin with, right? So Brian Greene, in his book, The Fabric of the Cosmos, deals with the question of, well, how do we know the universe didn't start 20 minutes ago? Right? In other words, it just popped into existence. We all popped into existence with our memories intact. So we have, but the universe itself only actually started 20 minutes ago. Right? And this is one of the leading physicists in the world. And he basically comes down and says, well, strictly on the laws of science, and you would want to pick the 20 minutes ago because that's a lesser entropy state. That's more likely than having a Big Bang. Because that's a very high entropy. This is since it's been declining, it's by definition a less entropy. So,
I don't know the word entropy.
Order.
Okay.
Yeah, think about you got everything nicely stacked up in your kitchen, and then you cook, and then it's a big mess.
Mm-hmm.
Before you started cooking, you had a higher entropy level than after you cooked.
Well, let's test the Big Bang. What do Big Bangs usually create? Do they create order, or do they create chaos?
Well, if you go the inflationary Big Bang, it's actually a very strong argument for the existence of God, which is why most physicists don't like the inflationary Big Bang. They keep coming back to it over and over and over because that's where the evidence points that the universe came into this very high entropy state. That's why they have what's an alternate theory called it's P-brane theory. It's basically off of a membrane. So you think of these quantum bubbles bouncing against each other, and where the bubbles bounce and collapse, that's where the universe gets created. They like that because it's more of a quantum physics. Problem is to have these membranes bouncing back and forth, you still end up with, that's an energy state that would decay over time, so you still have to get that whole process. So you don't really solve anything that way. The inflationary Big Bang actually does solve it. It says, okay, you got the beginning of the universe, boom, the universe is there at a very high entropy state, and from there on it's just been decaying.
Well,
That
that's not
actually
how
fits.
explosions work.
Well, this isn't a typical explosion.
It must not be.
No, it's not. It is by definition not an explosion in that sense. Because for one thing, an explosion implies that you had something there that exploded.
Exactly.
This isn't something there and exploding. This is something coming into existence. And it explains everything very nicely except for one thing. How do you account for that coming into existence? And as Christians, we argue, well, God created the universe. So even if you don't believe in the Big Bang, or you don't believe the universe is 13.5 billion years old, when you're talking to a skeptic who does, right, why try to convince multiple things at once? Start where they are and say, okay, we'll grant you for the sake of argument the Big Bang. How did it happen? Do you believe it came in something from nothing, which in my book is magic? Or do you believe that something caused the Big Bang? And if something caused the Big Bang, isn't that God?
Yeah, I think all of their theories are just begging for Occam's razor to come in and take them apart.
Well, in
Simplest
many respects, the history of
explanation.
science for the last 200 years has been them trying to get away from the Bible's, the idea that God created the universe, and the evidence forcing them back. Now, in the 19th century, the idea was that we had an eternal universe. The universe always existed just as it is. If you have an eternal universe, there's no reason for a creator. And that existed through basically all of the 19th century. Then Einstein came along with his theory of relativity, and one of the side effects of the theory of relativity is that the idea of an eternally existing universe fell apart. Because if the universe is static like that, well, you can't have a static, because Einstein says everything's interrelated. So in other words, if anything moved, suddenly that would start a whole chain of reaction throughout the entire universe, and something would happen. So the universe could not exist as it always has existed. It had to be transforming itself in some fashion or another. And with the introduction of the redshift theory, and we won't get into a whole, they basically 1920s discovered that the universe was expanding. Well, if you figure the universe is expanding, well then if you run that backwards, it's contracting and contracting, and suddenly you have a beginning point. And that was originally the Big Bang Theory was rejected for that very reason, is it had from the 1920s up until about the 1960s, it was largely rejected because it implied that there was a beginning to the universe, and the scientists didn't want a beginning to the universe. They wanted they wanted an eternally existing universe. But eventually the evidence became so overwhelming that they ended up having to accept the beginning of the universe. And at that point, they started with, well, maybe it's oscillating. It expands out and then slows down, stops, and then contracts back in. And when I originally wrote my book in the 1980s, that was the very popular theory, that the universe would explode out and collapse back in. And they were spending a lot of time trying to find something called dark matter that would allow there to be enough matter in the universe to slow down the expansion of gravitational forces and pull the universe back in so it could explode again. Because that way they could avoid a beginning. Well, they couldn't find the black matter. And then in the late 1990s, someone decided, well, let's look at this a different way. And they decided to measure the actual deceleration of the galaxies, because they figured they could measure the deceleration of the galaxies. They could calculate whether it was going to slow down enough before, the issue was it would get too far away before the gravitational forces no longer could pull it back. Well, when they did that, they found out, lo and behold, the galaxies are not slowing down. They're accelerating. So there's no way you're going to have an oscillation. This is a one-time deal. They came together, they exploded out, and not only are they not slowing down from gravitational forces, they're actually accelerating. So that's where they get to today with the inflationary Big Bang theory and the P-brain theory. And they're still trying to come up with some way to avoid the implication that the universe was created, that the universe came into existence, because they just don't want to go there. I told you it was dangerous to ask me questions. Anyway, so we were on verse 7 about things not seen. So Noah built the ark, and he didn't just cobble this thing together, but it says here he built it reverently. This was an act of service to God. We might think of, it's just, you're told a flood's coming, so you're going to bang together a boat so you can get out. No, he didn't do it because of that.
Remind me how many years it took?
About 100. He did it to serve God, because this is what God had commanded him to do. And of course you can imagine all the ridicule and doing what, flood. No one's ever seen a flood like that before. Here you're building a boat so far away from water. By it, he condemned the world. And here it's one of those ambiguities in the text that it says by it. We're not really exactly sure what it refers to. Right? It could be his faith, or it could be the ark. So either by the faith that he exhibited, in contrast to those that didn't have faith, or by his building the ark, he condemned the world, because then God would bring the flood. But, so the last part, to inherit this, he inherited the righteousness. And here Noah is the first person in the Bible to be called righteous. So remember, this whole chapter is structured into 3 sections, and they're basically broken down into 3 short, 1 long, 3 short, 1 long. So those are the 3 short. Now we'll go into a little bit longer description when we come to Abraham. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. And this is going to be the longest description in this chapter, because we spend most of the time on Abraham, or at least the longest part of it. And think about being called to go someplace by God, and you're not even knowing where you're going. Right? And you think about people who are called today as missionaries. Many of them accept a call to missions even if they don't know exactly where they're going yet. That takes a lot of faith. Think about all the places. So you're going to go and sign up to, Missions R Us. And you go in there and they have a big wheel. And when you turn in your application and you get accepted, they go up to the wheel and they spin it. And it spins around and around and around and eventually lands on a particular location and says, okay, that's where you get to go. And then think about all the places in the world that you wouldn't want to go. I mean, God wanted to send me on an all-expense paid mission trip to London. I think that would be a pretty good thing. I'd volunteer for that. Right? Wouldn't have to learn a new language. Be able to indulge my love of history and go back to the land of my birth and all sorts of fun stuff, right? Well, what if it ended up on Sierra Leone or the Sudan or Ethiopia or Indonesia or Iran? Probably wouldn't have the same sense of enthusiasm.
Let's go to North Korea.
Or North Korea. Yeah.
Or the United States.
Well, I'm already here, so. Yeah.
I've just reflected on people who, believers, a black friend of mine, and he came to the U.S. and he felt like this is the worst place God could have sent him because of the unbelief, the cynicism.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you'd find more unbelief and cynicism in Europe, but yeah it's crass materialism. My mother-in-law is still offended by Christmas here because she comes from Germany, where it's, even today, it's still revered as a holy day. And we can associate a lot of words with Christmas here in the United States, but do we really associate Christmas as holy? Not really. Discount sales and Santas and all sorts of stuff, but we don't have a lot of holiness left for Christmas. But here Abraham was called to go, and it wasn't getting on a jet and flying someplace. It was picking up everything and moving his entire family, not knowing where he was going. Why did he do it?
Obedience.
Obedience. But why did he obey?
You have faith.
He had faith. Faith in what? That he'd get a big reward when he got there?
Probably just like we told Isaac, God will provide.
God will provide. So he had faith in God. And too often when we do things, even when we're doing things for God, it's because we expect God to do something at the other end. God will give us this, or God will do that, or I'm going to go on a missions trip, and when I get there, God is going to allow me to convert hundreds and hundreds of people. And yet some people were called to go on missions, and what happened when they got to their destination? They're killed. You know, he was mentioning Mission Aviation Fellowship. Used to be in Redlands, California, where I live. If you don't know Mission Aviation Fellowship, they're the largest scheduled airline in the world. You just probably don't flow on them because unless you're a missionary, because they tend to fly areas that nobody else flies. And that's their mission. They go places nobody else goes. Fly into places nobody else flies into. So, for example, they're actually used by the UN and other bodies simply because if you want to get to some of these remote areas, Mission Aviation Fellowship is the only one that goes there. But they do it as a Christian ministry, and they're primarily serving Christian missionaries in their efforts. And in their headquarters, they have the frame of a plane that one of their original missionaries flew down to South America, and they landed, and within a few days, they were all killed. And through the grace of God, over a period of time, the Indians that had killed them ended up regretting that and ended up coming to Christ. And eventually the son of one of the missionaries went down there and was a major role in their salvation. And that plane was then salvaged and brought back up to Mission Aviation Fellowship. But you think about these guys, group of 5 men, many with families. They flew down there. Obviously one had a child on a mission trip, and they were killed. As a result of that, the whole tribe was saved. But did they see that? And I would venture to argue the families didn't see that at the time either.
Is this where one of the wives remained? She refused to leave the field? I'm thinking of somebody in my lifetime.
Could be. This was back in the 50s,
Mm-hmm.
if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
So,
The point of the spear, I think, is
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But God sometimes calls us not to fame and glory and success, but to die, to suffer. And we may not know in this life why he does it. So why do it? Why go through that? Because of faith in God. But that does change your concept of who God really is. Right? It's hard to have a wealth and health type view of God, that he's just going to provide wonderful things for me and make my life easy and everything's going to go nice, with the concept of church history when we see what's really happened. We get the advantage in church history because we can see what happened, but we can also see the results. We can see what's happening to us, but we don't know what the results will be. But with faith in God and trusting in him, even when things don't go the way we think they should, or at the timing they should, come on, God, you're not following my time schedule.
Was it Michael Card, I think, on that incident he wrote a song, I think, called Come Be a Fool? And so the idea that sometimes...
I don't know if it was about that song, but that particular song is one of my favorite songs.
Yeah, and so there's that idea that sometimes God says, come be a fool for me. Yeah, everybody's going to look at you and say, what? You're crazy.
Scandalon.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And sometimes that's what we have to be. But we need to do that not out of rewards not knowing that God's gonna, just give us a lot of stuff. But we do it for one reason. The same reason my daughter painted that stone. We do it out of love. Well, we go ahead and close there. Pick up again next week in verse 9 as we blaze through this chapter. Go ahead and close.